Well, details of President Trump's latest tariff round are scarce, but countries have already begun to prepare responses. China reportedly taking steps to bar companies from investing in the U.S., according to Bloomberg. The EU warning they hold a lot of cards when it comes to combating the new tariffs, and Canada promising retaliatory measures would follow, depending on what's announced today. Joining us now, Kellyanne Shaw, a partner at the global law firm Hogan Lovells and one of the key architects of the first Trump administration's trade policy. Kellyanne, can't think of a better voice to speak with today as we head into this so-called Liberation Day. I know when you worked with the president in 1.0, he talked a lot about the lack of fairness associated with tariffs. That drove his policy positioning. For today, does that objective of his equate to a maximalist trade approach or a country-specific approach that could include negotiations?
Yeah, good morning, and thanks so much for having me on. So I think the president has two primary objectives. So the first is about leveling the playing field. And I heard him talk about this multiple times during Trump 1.0, which is that it's not fair that other countries maintain higher tariffs, higher non-tariff barriers than the United States does. And so these tariffs that he's announcing today are an effort to really level the playing field, and they also give trading partners an opportunity to lower their barriers to meet the U.S., and that the U.S. would also lower theirs on a reciprocal basis. But the other objective is to really address this long-standing and persistent trade deficit, this trillion-dollar trade deficit that is eating away at U.S. GDP growth. And I think the president's view is that if he puts tariffs in place, that will help overall balance the trading relationship. But of course, we don't know what the final measure is going to be. The White House has floated anything from 10 to 20% and even as high as 25% from former Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross yesterday. So we'll have to wait and see what ultimately the president decides to do.
Kellyanne, as somebody who was inside of these negotiations, I mean, what is this process, right? This is why does it take place in such a sort of open and public fashion, which seems to be much more disruptive for markets, for business decision making? As someone who's been inside it, like, why not just make the decision and do it? You know, what insight can you give us into that?
Yeah, and I've gotten this question a lot from various clients as well. And what I would say is I would have been more surprised if the president had arrived at a final decision last week. And that is because the president takes all of these decisions all the way up to the line and to the last minute when it comes to tariffs. And this will be the single largest tariff announcement in modern history. So it is not surprising to me that he is holding his powder until the very last moment. And part of the president's negotiating strategy is this intentional ambiguity. It is to leave trading partners guessing, to leave everyone uncertain as to what he's going to do. And when he does make that big announcement, it really will kick off this massive negotiation where other countries will have the opportunity to come to the table and see if they can negotiate down reciprocally. Now, I know that that negotiating strategy is effective when dealing with other trading partners, but it does give a lot of anxiety to businesses and to the markets who are trying to figure out what's going on. And what I would say there is that businesses and the markets aren't really the audience for this right now. I think some of those assurances and discussions and briefings will come after today's announcement. But right now, his messaging is to the American people and it's to trading partners.
Is it effective, Kellyanne? What evidence do we have that that is a successful negotiating tactic? Do we have? I mean, we have the tariffs that stayed in place from the first administration, but those weren't really negotiated back and forth upon to that high of a degree. I mean, what would you point to as sort of a success story of this negotiating tactic?
Yeah, and this is a tactic that the president has employed for decades. And what I would say from Trump 1.0 is the successful renegotiation of NAFTA, so the USMCA agreement.
Well, but it wasn't successful because now he doesn't like it and is throwing it out. So what I guess then the other question is, what defines success?
Right, but I think it was incredibly successful for the United States, Canada, and Mexico. But what's unique about USMCA is it has this review mechanism. It is a living agreement. It was not designed to stay in place, for forever. There is a requirement that all three countries get together and renegotiate and review that deal. And so I think that's what this is teeing up in terms of the president's pressure on Canada and Mexico to address some of these unfair trade practices. And we also saw the same playbook with China as well as South Korea with the chorus renegotiation. The president has a big job in front of him. He is setting out not just to negotiate one or two relationships, but the U.S.'s economic relationship with every country on earth. And it will come down to implementation to see whether or not the administration is successful. But my point is, I'm not surprised that this is the tactic that the president is taking.
If the president does push us into a recession, which so many sources we speak with say this policy has the potential to do, is that something that makes him more amenable to negotiation in your view?
Yeah, I think the administration is trying to land this shy of a recession, right? So they've talked about tariffs being part of their broader economic strategy, which includes tax cuts, deregulation, energy diversity. And they really do have to land all of these things for this to work. This is a big swing. This is unprecedented in terms of modern U.S. history. And so the administration has a really big job in front of it to make sure that we stave off recession, that we end up in a place where Americans are better off a year from now than they are today. And so I'm watching very closely to see exactly how the president messages this, because again, I think this is an uphill battle for him.
Do you think he knows right now what he's going to announce at 4 p.m. today?
I do.
All right, Kellyanne, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.